Hook, hey friend, if you're sitting there right now with a heart that feels a little too heavy, a little too scared to try again, stay with me. Because what you're about to hear isn't just another love story. It's the kind that sneaks up on you when you've already given up. The kind where one quiet question in a dark parking lot can rewrite everything you thought you knew about yourself. I'm going to walk you through every tear, every silent prayer, every moment Matthew Carter never saw coming, and I promise, if you stay until the very last word, you might just feel something inside you start to heal too. This is for every person who's ever whispered, I can't love again. Ready? Let's begin. Matthew Carter was 38 years old the night his life quietly began again, though he didn't know it yet. He lived in a small rented house on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, where the winter wind rattled the windows like it was trying to remind him he was still alive. His divorce had been final for 14 months, but the papers might as well have been tattooed on his chest. Every evening he came home to the same silence that used to be filled with laughter, arguments, and the clatter of dishes. Now there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of his own footsteps. He had stopped believing in second chances the day his wife walked out with the words, "You're too broken to fix, Matt. And I'm tired of trying." Work was his only refuge, a small manufacturing plant on the edge of town where the machines never asked questions and the shifts were long enough to keep his mind from wandering too far into the past. He was the quiet guy in the break room, the one who nodded politely but never stayed for small talk. Until Sarah Mitchell started on the day shift. She was 34, with kind eyes that seemed to carry whole stories behind them and a soft voice that somehow cut through the noise of the factory floor. Sarah had lost her husband in a car accident 3 years earlier and then, 6 months later, her only sister to the same cruel twist of fate. Now she was raising her 8-year-old nephew, Ethan, on her own. Most people saw a gentle woman who always remembered birthdays and brought extra coffee for the night crew. Matthew saw something else, a quiet strength wrapped around deep, unspoken pain, the same kind he carried. Their first real conversation happened on a rainy Tuesday in early spring. The power had flickered twice during the night shift, and everyone was exhausted. Sarah had stayed late to help cover for a sick coworker. Matthew found her in the break room staring at a cold cup of coffee like it held answers. "Rough night?" he asked, surprising himself. She looked up and smiled, tired but real. "Ethan had a nightmare again. Called me 3 times before I left for work. Some days I feel like I'm failing him and the whole world at the same time." Matthew didn't know why he answered the way he did. Maybe it was the honesty in her voice. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "My ex used to say I was already gone even when I was standing right there. Took me a long time to realize she was right. I just stopped showing up for anything that could hurt me again." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that felt like permission to breathe. From then on, little moments started stacking up like bricks in a wall neither of them had planned to build. She'd save him the last donut on Fridays. He'd walk her to her car when the parking lot lights were out. They talked about everything and nothing, Ethan's soccer games, the way Matthew's hand still shook sometimes when he remembered signing the divorce papers, the old hymn Sarah's grandmother used to sing that somehow made the world feel less heavy. Months slipped by. Friendship grew roots so deep neither of them noticed until it was too late to pull them up. Matthew started praying again, not the loud, desperate kind from his childhood, but quiet whispers in the truck on the way home. "God, if you're still listening. I don't know how to do this anymore." Sarah never pushed. She just showed up, steady as sunrise, carrying her own invisible scars with grace that made him want to be better. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late October, the kind of cold that settled into your bones. The shift had run long because of a broken conveyor belt, and by the time they clocked out, the parking lot was almost empty. Rain hammered the windshield as Matthew walked Sarah to her car like he always did. She stopped before opening the door, keys dangling from her fingers, and turned to face him. The streetlight caught the tears she wasn't trying to hide. "So," her voice trembled but didn't break. "Can you refuse me tonight?" Matthew's heart slammed against his ribs. He knew what she was really asking. Not just tonight. Not just a moment. She was asking if he could keep pretending this was only friendship when both of them had already fallen so far there was no climbing back. He looked at her, really looked, and saw every fear he carried mirrored in her eyes. The fear of losing again. The fear of not being enough. The fear that love might destroy what little they had left. But beneath that fear was something brighter, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair, and said the words that would echo in his soul for the rest of his life. "No," he whispered, voice raw. "Because I'm already in love with you." Sarah's breath caught. For a long moment she just stared at him, tears mixing with rain. Then she laughed, soft, broken, beautiful, and pulled him into a hug that felt like coming home after a war neither of them had chosen to fight. That night they sat in his truck for hours, talking until the rain stopped and the first hints of dawn colored the sky. Matthew told her everything, the nights he'd cried alone, the way he'd stopped believing he deserved good things. Sarah told him about the nights she'd held Ethan while he asked why God took his parents, and how she'd kept showing up anyway because love was the only thing stronger than grief. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. The promise was already there, quiet and certain. But love, they learned, isn't a finish line, it's a road with potholes deep enough to break axles. The first real test came 3 weeks later when Ethan got sick. Really sick. A fever that wouldn't break, followed by a diagnosis of pneumonia that landed him in the hospital for 9 days. Sarah barely left his side. Matthew showed up every single evening after his shift, bringing coffee, clean clothes, and the kind of steady presence she hadn't realized she needed so desperately. One night, when the monitors beeped too loudly and Sarah's shoulders finally caved under the weight, she whispered, "I'm so scared I'm going to lose him too." Matthew took her hand right there in the hospital hallway, in front of nurses and worried families, and said, "You're not alone anymore. Not tonight. Not ever." He didn't pray out loud, but later that night in the chapel down the hall he dropped to his knees for the first time in years and begged, really begged, for healing, for strength, for the kind of faith Sarah carried like armor. Ethan recovered. But the medical bills didn't. Sarah's savings disappeared faster than either of them could track. Matthew started picking up overtime, then double shifts, until exhaustion etched lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Some nights he'd come home and just sit on the edge of the bed, head in his hands, wondering if he was strong enough for this. The old fears whispered loudest in the dark. What if I fail her the way I failed my marriage? What if love isn't enough when life keeps swinging? Sarah saw it all. One Sunday morning she woke him gently before dawn and drove them to the little white church on the hill where she'd grown up. They sat in the back pew while the sun painted the stained glass in soft colors. No big sermon. No dramatic altar call. Just quiet hymns and the simple truth she'd been carrying all along. "Love isn't about being perfect, Matthew," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's about choosing each other even when it's hard. Even when you're scared. That's what faith is, choosing to believe the light is still there even when you can't see it yet." He cried that morning. Not loud, noisy tears, but the kind that come from the deepest part of a man who's been holding his breath for years. For the first time since the divorce, he let himself believe he was allowed to be happy again. The road didn't suddenly get easy, but it got lighter. They faced the bills together, crowdfunding from co-workers, a surprise bonus from the plant, late-night budget talks at the kitchen table with Ethan coloring beside them. Matthew started coaching Ethan's soccer team on weekends. Sarah began teaching him how to pray the way she did, not for miracles, but for strength to keep showing up. Slowly, the broken pieces inside both of them started fitting back together in a pattern more beautiful than before. 6 months after that rainy night in the parking lot, Matthew got down on one knee in the same church where they'd found their footing again. No fancy ring, just a simple band he'd saved for month after month. Ethan stood beside him holding a single rose, grinning like he'd known this was coming all along. Sarah said yes before he even finished the question. They didn't have a perfect wedding. They had a small one, with factory friends and church family and a little boy who finally believed he had a dad again. But it was theirs. And when Matthew stood at the altar and looked into the eyes of the woman who had refused to let him stay broken, he understood something he wished he could tell every person watching this right now. Love doesn't always arrive with fireworks and perfect timing. Sometimes it shows up in the middle of the night shift, wearing exhaustion and old scars like badges of honor. Sometimes it asks you the scariest question you've ever heard: "Can you refuse me tonight?" And the bravest answer you can give is no, because your heart already said yes months ago. So if you're out there tonight carrying wounds you think will never heal, if you've sworn you'll never risk your heart again, listen to the quiet voice that sounds a lot like hope. Open the door just a crack. Let someone see the real you, the scared parts, the tired parts, the parts still learning how to believe again. Because sometimes the most powerful love stories don't start with "once upon a time." They start with two broken people choosing each other anyway. And they end with the kind of healing you never thought possible. Matthew Carter learned that truth the hard way. And because he did, he wants you to know, you're not too far gone. You're not too broken. The light is still coming. All you have to do is stop refusing it. Stay kind. Keep believing. And never forget, the best chapter of your life might be waiting in the very place you're most afraid to look. The end, but only for now. Your story is still being written. Go live it.